Hello, Eastside Youth. If you're watching this and you're thinking that I have worn the same shirt for 3 days, I have not. I wanted to pre-record this one, this midweek check-in, just because Anna and I may be going out to the coast to see my brother-in-law, her brother, this Thursday, and so I just wanted to make sure that if that happens, and if we're gone most of the day Thursday, that this goes out and it's done, and that it is not rushed and all that type stuff. So this is the midweek check-in encouragement. We are still in Galatians. We had a really good time. It was cool to have Bethany with us Sunday night, uh, and yeah, it was just a good time together, biking, having frozen treats, and then we hung out after youth group a little bit too, which was really fun. So yeah, this is your midweek check-in. If you have not heard, just to before we get into this, there is new stuff about face masks and group sizes for public places and all that stuff. And as I've been explained it, that does not apply to churches currently, and so we will still be meeting on Sunday mornings at 8:45 and Sunday nights at 4. But I will keep you guys posted and updated. Just remember, try to wear a mask if you can. And yeah, but we will still be gathering together at this time. And if something changes, I'll let you guys know. Praying that it doesn't. So, but this week we are in Galatians chapter 2, verse 15. And if you remember last week, we talked about Paul opposing Peter. And it was opposition. It was not like he comes out swinging at Peter, because Peter, who was a big leader in the church, the early church, he had been around Galatians, Gentiles, so non-Jewish believers. He had been around them, ate with them, had dinner with them, hung out with them. But when the Jewish Christians come to town, he stopped doing that. And Paul is calling him out like, you are not helping this situation, because there are people who are trying to tell these Gentile Christians, these Galatian believers, that they have to be circumcised in order to actually be saved by Jesus. And Paul's essentially saying, Peter, when you behave the way that you do, you are kind of lending some credibility to that hey, maybe that is true. And so Paul calls him out. He says, don't live differently. Like, be the same person around the Jewish Christians as you are around the Gentile Christians. They're saved by the same Jesus. That's essentially what Paul had for Peter last week. And this week is more of the theological, like meat and potatoes sense of how Paul and why Paul is saying and doing what he's doing. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Galatians chapter 2, verse 15. It says, we ourselves, so he's talking about Paul himself and Peter. He says, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also believed in Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. But if, in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too were found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. And so Paul introduces this word that we're going to talk a little bit about. Pastor Ben talked about it on Sunday morning. It's this word justified. And this is a positional word. And we have this word kind of in the courtroom, of being like justified. You're counted as not guilty or guilty, this type thing. In the biblical sense of it, it's more of a positional standing of righteousness. And so to be counted as justified means to be seen as righteous by God. And to be seen as righteous by God is a big task because of the whole problem of sin. And so, one of the ways that I've heard it put, if you can't remember, I don't think it's the most perfect way to put it, but if you're like struggling, like what does it mean to be justified? It's the idea that to be justified is before God looks as if just as if I'd never sinned. Justified, just as if I'd never sinned. Now there is sin, and you have, and that's why there's more to it than that. But positionally, it's this idea that God sees righteousness when He looks at you. That's what justification. That's what it means to be justified before God. And so Paul here is talking about how do we become justified? How, when God looks on us, does He see someone who is righteous? And he starts talking about the law, and he says, "Listen, we ain't justified by the law. The only thing that the law gets us is more law. It all the law does is shows us the ways that we are not able to be justified. It says, well, don't do this. Well, shoot, I did that last week. Don't do that. Well, I just did that 3 seconds ago. Like, and Paul's saying, like, no one is going to be justified by works of the law. You can't. Because the minute that maybe you were starting to keep one, you got to keep it up. You got to keep going. And so then he goes on to say that once we have this position, so we can't be justified by the law, we're justified in Jesus Christ because of his death. If then we've been justified, if God looks on us and he sees righteousness, verse 17 starts to talk about, well, like, what about the fact that we still sin from there? He says, but if in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we're found to be sinners, is Christ a servant of sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. In other words, like, you can still sin. There is this idea that you can still sin and do things that are contrary to God, even though you've been justified. And that is where the work of Jesus Christ comes in. Because where in the old system of the law, if that happened, if you had made yourself clean and then you walked out and you instantly did something to make yourself unclean, fall back, turn back in. Sometimes you have to wait like a week outside the camp until you are able to go in to offer sacrifice, atone for what happened, and then come back in. And in Christ, he's talking about, like, we don't have to do that anymore. It's a once and for all justification of sin, from sin. He says, for through the law, I died to the law. All you did in the law was kept dying. You could try to keep it until your last day, and you're going to die in the law. You're stuck. But then he says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So in other words, Paul's saying that when Jesus died, when a person puts their faith in Jesus Christ, who died for them, something happens in how God views them, that when God looks on them and they says, okay, they have put their saving faith in Jesus, so the part of them that keeps them from being justified before me was put to death on that cross. It died with Jesus that day. So now when God looks on us in our justified state, it's no longer we who live, but Christ who lives in us. And as such, he spins it on his head. The argument is like, well, why do we keep sinning? He goes, yeah, don't. Because the life you now live, you should be living that to Jesus, who loved you and gave himself for you. And then at the end he closes, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. In other words, he sets it up like this. And remember, he's kind of like a little bit in Peter's face and kind of hitting the Galatians with something too here. He goes, you got to make a choice, y'all. You can try to get right standing with God through the law. Paul says it here. If righteousness were through the law, Christ died for nothing. He says, so in other words, you either got to choose. You got to pick one or the other. You can either try to do this stuff and keep it the rest of your life and make sure that you never goof, or you can take Jesus, who in his dying on the cross says, I know you're going to goof. You were never meant to be able to keep the whole law. And if you put your faith in me, that part of you that keeps you from being justified dies with me, and you are seen right in God's eyes. So he gives them a choice. He's like, if you want to do the righteousness by the law, then Christ died for nothing. So you can't have both. You can't be saying, well, I've got Jesus, but also I'm gonna just make sure that I keep some of this stuff, because that is contrary. Because accepting Christ's work on the cross on our behalf means admitting I could do nothing to save myself. So you can't have both, and that's what Paul lays out to the Galatians here. He says, y'all gotta choose. Because if you think that you can do this on your own by working real hard and being a real good guy, you're essentially saying Jesus died for no reason. And I don't think that the Galatian church that he's writing to, I don't think they actually believe that. So I think Paul's kind of being with them. He's kind of getting them. He's like, you see how ridiculous this is? That's kind of what he's doing. The same is true for us. We're justified by faith alone in Jesus Christ alone. Done. You can't work for it. You can't work to change that. Now, once you are saved, that life that you're living is now lived out in new life in Christ. That's good. It should look and agree with who Jesus is, who God is. And we're talking about that in Sunday night in Deuteronomy. We start talking about loving God and obeying God. Those things are tied up together. But that is Galatians chapter 2. We've finished it, so we'll move on to chapter 3 next week. I hope you guys are having a good week, enjoying the sunshine. It's beautiful out there. Stay safe, stay healthy, do your best. We love you guys. We'll see you Sunday.